And welcome to another treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled Justice and the Marginalized. And it's taken from Deuteronomy, the 24th chapter, verses 10 through 21. And it's the winter quarter, lesson number 9, for January the 30th, 2022. Now, a little background information. Today's lesson, of course, is more or less a continuation of what we talked about last week, about how the Jewish people, when they lived in their theocracy, how they were to treat people. And this section of scriptures, chapters 12 through 30, are the civil and social laws that governed the people of Israel as they went into the promised land. And it more or less constituted the covenant relationship between God and his people. Okay? Now, Deuteronomy 24:10 and 11. When you make a loan of any kind to your neighbor, do not go into the house to get what is offered to you as a pledge. Stay outside and let the neighbor to whom you are making the loan bring the pledge out to you. Now, I like what John Wesley said about this particular section of Scripture. He said, to prevent both the poor man's reproach by having his want exposed and the creditor's greediness which might be occasioned by the sight of something which he desired and the debtor could not spare. And this method, this restriction, really, to be honest with you, was to prevent the hurting of the person borrowing, the hurting of their feelings. And also, too, to keep the person loaning from lording it over the person borrowing. And we have to be really careful about that. If we're going to help somebody, we don't need to make any kind of big spectacle out of it. We need to be as polite and as low-key about what we give as much as we possibly can. What we don't want to do is to have someone's feelings hurt and to put on a big show. Because if we put on a big show, we'll get no reward for this in heaven, for one thing. The second thing is, too, is that it really hurts people for you to put on a big show about how much you are helping them and how they're in this bad position. Okay? Now, Deuteronomy 24:12 and 13. If the neighbor is poor, do not go to sleep with your pledge in your possession. Return their cloak by sunset so that your neighbor may sleep in it. Then they will thank you, and it will be regarded as a righteous act in the sight of the Lord your God. It's really important for us to get a good grasp of what is being said here in the law. What is being said is that there should never, ever be the situation where you are taking advantage of someone, where you're leaving them where they're utterly destitute. And from a historical standpoint, a lot of the poorer people in the Middle East would take their cloak and their coat and they would sleep in it. And that's what kept them warm at night. And it's the only thing they had to keep themselves warm. So if you kept it overnight, you would be putting them in a position where they were going to be cold and miserable all through the night. And what God is saying here is that you should have consideration for people to where you don't put them in the position to where they're going to be absolutely, utterly miserable. So he's saying here is that if they are poor and they're going to be the kind of person who's going to sleep in their garment, make sure you return that garment by nightfall so they don't go through the night sleepy. Okay? Now, Deuteronomy 24:14 and 15. Do not take advantage of a hired worker who is poor and needy, whether that worker is a fellow Israelite or a foreigner residing in one of your towns. Pay them their wages each day before sunset, because they are poor and are counting on it. Otherwise, they may cry to the Lord against you, and you will be guilty of sin. That's an extremely important concept. If people are coming and doing work for you, whatever timetable that they can live with, whatever timetable that they can be able to agree to, or that they agreed to, that is the exact timetable that you should be paying people. I mean, people can, all of us have gotten in a bad spot from time to time where maybe we had a lot of medical bills or something like that was unforeseen that come up. And I think all of us at one time or another have hit those kind of spots. But it is extremely important that when you take someone who is working for a living and they come and do work, it is extremely important that you don't deadbeat them, because they are depending on that for their living. And it is a grave sin to sit there and deadbeat a worker who has done something and came and their family is depending on that money, and you deadbeat them. It's extremely important not to do that. Proverbs 14 and 31, whoever oppresses the poor shows contempt for their maker, and whoever is kind to the needy honors God. My favorite prophet, Brother Amos. Amos 4:1 and 2. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, on Mount Samaria, you women who oppress the poor and crush the needy, and say to your husbands, bring us some drinks. Sovereign Lord God has shown by his holiness the time will surely come when you will be taken away with hooks, the last of you with fish hooks. And historically, that's exactly what happened to the people of Samaria. They were very cruel to the poor working people of their area, and they would take advantage of them at all opportunities. And Amos was pointing that out. And Amos also said there will be the times coming when you're going to be led away with hooks and with fishing hooks. That is exactly, historically, that is exactly what happened to the northern kingdom. When the Assyrians came in and they hauled those people off, a lot of them were hooked through the jaw like they were a fish, and that's how they were led into bondage. They were led that way. And Amos called those people, those women, the cows of Bashan. because they sat there and took advantage of poor working people in their community. Okay? Now, Deuteronomy 24:16. Parents are not to be put to death for their children, nor children put to death for their parents. Each will die for their own sin. Now, you'll see situations where people will, somebody's daddy will do something to somebody and they'll hold it against the kids. Somebody's dad will mess up on a job, and the kids will come later to try to get a job at that place, and the owner of the company won't hire them because he had a bad experience with a dad. And that does happen, but it shouldn't. The Bible specifically says that shouldn't happen. You should not hold it against a child for something that the parent did. Okay? The same way you shouldn't hold it against a parent because of something the child did. Ezekiel 18:20, the one who sins is the one who will die. The child will not share the guilt of the parent, nor will the parent share the guilt of the child. The righteousness of the righteous will be credited to them, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be charged against them. But now let me point something out. And I think this is what the Bible is talking about when it's talking about the sins will be visited to the second, third, fourth generation. Is that if you go out and you do something horrible, let's say that a father, all he wants to do is just go lay drunk. And he's got a house full of kids. And all he wants to do is lay drunk. Doesn't want to work. Those children are going to suffer the consequences of that going on. Let's say the parents have decided they're going to go out and run around and get girlfriends and boyfriends and what have you. Those children are going to suffer consequences. And sometimes, and oftentimes, even the grandchildren will suffer consequences because of the sin and the unrighteousness that's in the parents and the grandparents and the great-grandparents' life. And you see that all the time. I mean, they are illnesses that some children are having to face and suffer through because their mama was out taking drugs. You let some lady who's pregnant stay hopped up on drugs the whole time that she's pregnant, and that child is going to have to suffer consequences for those actions. Now, that's what happens, but God will not hold it against a child because the parent did certain sins. Okay? But the natural consequences just happen that way. Okay? Now, Deuteronomy 24:17 and 18. Do not deprive the foreigner or the fatherless of justice, or take the cloak of the widow as a pledge. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you from there. That's why I command you to do this. Now, each of us has got a story. You know, it may be that your dad was alcoholic. It may be your dad was, or your mama was a drug addict. It may be that there was a lot of family violence in your house. It may be that you were extremely poor growing up. It may be that you were homeless when you were growing up. There are all kinds of stories that each of us have. And it's critical. It is critical for us to have empathy for people who are in dire straits. When we look at someone, to identify as much as we possibly can with what they are going through. It is critical that we identify with what they are going through, because it gives us the kind of compassion that we need to have. You know, when someone does something good for you at a very critical point in your life, and they show compassion for you at a very critical point in your life, that you remember what that feels like. You know, if you lived with your grandparents till you were 5, you remember what that feels like. So when you see some kid who is going through some hard times, you can identify. You can identify with that. And we need to have empathy as much as possible with different people as much as we possibly can. Now, it's important for us also, too, not to have this false sense of, oh, yeah, I know how that feels. You know, because they are, you know, don't build up your own challenges and stuff to try to make an equivalence between what you've experienced and what someone else has experienced. You know, for example, I have absolutely no concept of what it would be to be raped. So I can't tell a woman who's been raped that I know exactly how you feel, because I do not know exactly how she feels. So, you know, you have to be careful that you don't, you know, get silly about that. You know, and know that what is equivalent and what's not equivalent, and what may be in a way kind of similar. You kind of like figure, well, that's 100 times more worse, but I kind of got an idea why they're so upset. But we need to have that kind of compassion and empathy for people. Okay, Deuteronomy 24:19 through 21. When you are harvesting in your field and you overlook a sheaf, do not go back to get it. Leave it for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow, so that the Lord your God may bless you and all the work of your hands. When you beat the olives from the trees, do not go over the branches a second time. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again. Leave what remains for the foreigner, the fatherless, and the widow. Now, this was talking the people of that day, and the people all through this covenant relationship in Palestine. They were all agricultural people. I mean, almost to the last person, they were agricultural people. There were very few of them who were potters and that kind of thing. The vast majority of them were farmers and shepherds. Okay, so that is why this is being put in those terms. But it still, the concept is there. Leave some for other people. Don't be super greedy. Any way you can possibly leave stuff for the poor and the destitute, go ahead and do that. Leave it to where they can be sustained. And the same way goes with how we go through life. I mean, the way we deal with things. If there's any way you can give back and give back to the community, go ahead and do that. If you can give back in your time, if you can give back in your money, you give back in food, you give back in however you can possibly give back to the people in need, because God expects that out of us. Okay? Now, in conclusion, I want us to really stop and think about this in as much as we possibly can. I want us to put our mind and get it in our mind like this, that when we look at the poor or look at somebody who is going through hard times, try, if it's possible, to relate to the hard times they are going through. If you see somebody who can't pay their electric bill, and you have went through that, as most of us have, I have, I'll just be honest with you. I went through a period of time, me and Glenda Cho, we went through a period of time, about 6 months, where things were extremely hard. And when somebody comes in and says that, that their family can't pay their electric bill or their water bill, I can relate to that. I know how that feels. And I try to remember how that feels. To have compassion with people, to be compassionate, and to feel as much as I can for people. The other thing too, and this is just as critical, is when the poor come, when someone having a difficulty and they need visiting in the hospital, they need encouragement, they need comfort, they need food, as much as possible, see the Lord in their need. See the Lord in them. You remember the parable? Matthew 25, 34 and 36. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me." That's what we need to do. We need to, when we run across somebody in need, to picture the Lord in them. Okay? Well, friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend.